Alright guys, in my video yesterday, I was giving my recommendations for who should buy which card in various situations, specifically focusing on the new AMD cards, the 6800 XT and the 6800, and their most direct competitors with the 3080, and then the 3070 isn't really a direct competitor with the 6800, but it's, it's what we have for now. I'm expecting Nvidia to kind of fill in a gap with like a, maybe a 3070 Ti or something to kind of fall in between your 3080 and your 3070, but, making recommendations right now based on what we have. And in my comment section, as well as in other videos and other comment sections and discussions online, Reddit, all of that, a lot of people are debating how future-proof the different cards are. So I was seeing comments along the lines of, how could you recommend a 3080 for 4K when it only has 10 gigabytes of VRAM? And I did recommend the 3080 for 4K. Now notice that I also recommended the 6800 XT for 4K, as long as you didn't care much about ray tracing and things like that. So I want to get into that. So how future-proof are the different cards? Who's more future-proof, Nvidia or AMD? And maybe it depends on the particular card. Well, I'm going to start out right here with a hot take that a bunch of you are going to hate and yell at me in the comments section, but don't smash the dislike button and turn the video off because, I have other thoughts and I'm not saying that this is the card you should actually buy. But here's my hot take. Nvidia is by far the most future-proof, specifically talking about the 3090. Okay, well, so why is it more future-proof? So the big issue that a lot of people have with the 3080 is the 10 gigabytes of VRAM. And the AMD cards offering 16 gigabytes of VRAM, people are feeling that is more future-proof. Well, okay, the 3090 has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, and it has all of the other NVIDIA advantages. It has DLSS, which in certain titles does make games even more playable and could give you big advantages in the future. And yeah, AMD is working on a competitor to that, but we don't know when that'll be available or how well it will actually perform, right? So the 3090 has the DLSS, it has better ray tracing performance than AMD, it has better performance than a 3080. It has all the gigabytes of VRAM you could possibly need in any actual game in the near future. It probably has too much, honestly. And so, yeah, if you want to be the most future-proof you possibly can right now with GPUs that are currently actually, available. 3090s are becoming available. They do sell out very quickly, or you could buy one at some massively increased scalper rate or something like that. But the point is, if you want to be the most future-proof you can possibly be, buy an NVIDIA card, specifically the 3090. But I'm not recommending that everybody do that. For that to make sense to you, you need to have the money to financially responsibly purchase that card, and you need to be okay with the fact that you're getting massively diminishing returns for your money, and it is a terrible buy from a value perspective. But if you have plenty of disposable income, you're not going to miss a rent payment, you're not going to get a second mortgage on your house, you're not going to have to sell your car, you have free money to burn, and a few $1,000s if you need to pay some jacked up 3090 price right now, you just want a card and you want it to be the best and you want it to be future-proof, and that's something that you can afford to do and that's something that you want to do and you don't care about the value proposition, there you go. There's the answer. 3090 is the most future-proof card that you can buy today. Now, let's get into discussing the more realistic cards that people might actually buy. So the most interesting comparison is the 3080 against the 6800 XT. But we also have the 6800 in there, kind of up against the 3070, at least for now. So let's think about that. The big argument here seems to be, how much VRAM do games actually use? And we did see headlines, including on my channel, that the Godfall developers said that Godfall at 4K with everything turned on would use 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Well, I've done my best to test that. I don't actually have that game. I don't have a graphics card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM myself. And I don't even have a 4K monitor to test that on. But, Tech Power Up's a good, reputable place to look for things. And they have tested Godfall And they used a 3090 because it has all the VRAM headroom that you could possibly need. And they measured the VRAM, and as far as I can tell, they're saying this is actual usage, not allocation. And that's the big discussion on VRAM. When you're using a game and it says it's using some massive amount of VRAM, a lot of time that's how much it's allocating to be used, but isn't actually being used, okay? So anyway, according to Tech PowerUp, the maximum usage does go past 8 gigabytes. But it doesn't go past 10. It's looking like at 4K, they were using, a little over 8.5 gigabytes of VRAM in Godfall with the highest settings. And at 1440p, they were actually staying under 8 gigabytes. Sorry if you heard a notification thing over there on my other computer. Let me turn that volume down. Anyway, so what am I getting at here? What am I saying? I'm not saying that 10 gigabytes of VRAM shouldn't be a concern for you. But I am saying that as of right now, in terms of actual usage, 10 gigabytes does seem to be okay. Now, what about other titles? I've seen some people brought up headlines like, I've seen that Control can use over 18 gigabytes of VRAM. And you might be referring to this Tech PowerUp article from a while back, or one of the other things that reported on that. That's talking about at 8K, okay? That's talking about at specifically 8K. Whereas at 4K, it's not using that. It's using over 8 gigabytes, though. It is using over 8 gigabytes at 4K. All right? I've also heard people bringing up that Watch Dogs Legion, uses a lot of VRAM when you turn on DXR and DLSS. And that is true. It uses a lot, but according to Guru 3D, who measured it at Full HD, Wide QHD, and at Ultra HD, there's your 4K, and they used it with DXR and DLSS turned on, that pushes it right up to 8 gigabytes, but not past it, okay? So again, these are all games that exist right now. So right now, are we pushing past 8 gigabyte usage at 4K? Yes. So, would I recommend buying a 3070 for gaming at 4K with specifically ultra settings turned on? No. Do I think a 3070 can game at 4K with some settings turned down? Yes. Okay. Now, the 3080, can it game at 4K right now? Yes. Are games pushing past 8 gigabytes? Yes. Are they pushing back past 10 gigabytes actually used right now? As far as I can tell, no. They're not doing that yet, but could they in the future? We're talking about future-proofing. And that's where, personally, I would be a little hesitant to buy the 3080 if you can hang on a little bit longer, because we're seeing things like a 3080 Ti probably coming out with 20 gigabytes of VRAM or things like that. So what's the argument for games using more VRAM? Or actually, you know what? I'm going to go on a different sidebar here. Some of you guys watching this video, I always sometimes forget that, different people have different experience with computers and graphics cards and things like that. So what actually happens if a game tries to use more VRAM than you have? What actually happens? Why does this matter? Okay. Well, basically, more VRAM doesn't matter at all until it does. So in other words, having more VRAM doesn't make the game perform better. The only thing that matters is if the game tries to use more VRAM than you have, suddenly that matters a lot. Because now your graphics card will be trying to load information from the system RAM instead of from the VRAM, and this is going to have a lot more latency and lower bandwidth, and it will cause horrible stuttering in your game, and it's going to be awful. So again, more VRAM doesn't matter until it does, meaning it's fine until you run out. If you run out, though, you can just turn down a couple of settings. So like things like ray tracing and DLSS do use VRAM. You could turn those down. The biggest thing is textures. So maybe instead of running the 4K highest possible resolution texture pack, you run a slightly stepped down texture pack. And that'll have a visual impact in your games. You're turning down settings, and you're spending this much money on a graphics card, you probably don't want to have to turn down settings. And the thing is, right now, you won't have to at 10 gigabytes. You won't have to turn down settings. But again, we're talking future-proofing. So why would the games possibly start using 10 gigabytes or more of VRAM now all of a sudden? Well, we have the new consoles coming out. And the new consoles have 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, be aware that consoles share their VRAM as also being like the normal system RAM. So consoles are a little bit different. And so certain amounts of that VRAM aren't actually going to be used as VRAM during games. They're going to be used for like the operating system. I'm fairly certain that I've seen the Series X uses like 3.5 gigabytes as more for like reserved for the OS. Also, notice that in the Series X, 10 gigabytes are at 560 gigabytes per second, whereas the other 6 are running at a slower speed. Now, not slow enough that you couldn't use it in gaming, but they are at a slower speed. So if you think about games designed for consoles in mind, this latest generation of consoles, do keep in mind that only 10 gigabytes of the Series X are running at that full speed. And the full 16 gigabytes will not be used for the console entirely as VRAM, since it's sharing that between other things. I believe the PS5's a little bit different. I could be wrong on this. I'm not as much of an expert on the console stuff as I could be. But I believe that the 16 gigabytes in the PlayStation runs like at all the same speed, but at a lower speed than the high-speed 10 gigabyte portion on the Series X. So yeah, it's a little bit different on the PS5. So maybe they could use a larger portion at that, for the VRAM usage in games. I don't know exactly. But what does this tell us about future-proofing? So I think it's very likely that 8 gigabytes is going to be passed up in a lot more games. Some games are already doing it. So like I said, for ultra settings, specifically ultra settings, the 3070 8 gigabyte, it's not going to cut it at 4K Ultra. Right now in some games and definitely not in the future. But 10 gigabytes, I think, is going to last you longer than you might think. I think that it could last you the next couple of years. I think that it could possibly have a few games where you need to slightly lower a setting or two, which, again, you don't want to do when you're spending this much money. So that is a possible future-proofing concern. But remember, guys, you can just slightly turn down a setting to gain back a tiny bit of VRAM if it's using like 10.1 gigabytes and you only have 10. So that is definitely something to keep in mind when you're making these decisions. Okay, now, personally, okay, I'm not going to buy a 3080 with a 10 gigabytes of VRAM because I am a little bit concerned about that future-proofing. And a lot of times, I will like to keep a graphics card for more than just one graphics card generation. I'd like to keep it for 2 graphics cards generations, and I do like to run things at ultra settings when possible. So personally, I'm honestly probably not going to buy a 3080, but I don't think it's a bad decision, and I think it will be very future-proof. But nothing is ever completely future-proof. You can't buy a graphics card now and run everything at ultra settings at 4K forever. Eventually, things will catch up, and that you won't be able to do that. Okay, so how about the AMD cards with their 16 gigabytes? Well, VRAM is not going to be an issue for you anytime soon for those cards. So from a future-proofing perspective, the AMD cards, from a VRAM perspective, are great, fantastic, that's not going to be an issue. However, they have some other possible problems. So number one being that right now, at least, their ray tracing performance isn't maybe where you'd like it to be if you want to run everything at ultra settings. Current games, especially at 4K, aren't going to perform super well with ray tracing on the AMD cards. But if you maybe turn ray tracing down to medium, they could do a lot better, and especially if you're gaming at 1440p. At 1440p, I think that their ray tracing performance looks a lot more respectable in a lot of games, and that couldn't be that would be fine. Also, AMD cards are likely to get a little bit better at that over time because, speaking of the consoles, the console games, the consoles use AMD RDNA 2 graphics architecture, and so when new console games are developed with ray tracing in mind, it will be with that type of performance in mind. So I think that as game developers get more mature at developing ray tracing, I think that they will design it in a way that the consoles can run well, which will automatically mean, and I know it's not as simple as automatically mean that AMD's graphics cards will run it well as well, but that I think it'll be designed at a level where that's the case, but not necessarily at ultra settings. So anytime you try to look into the future, you're bound to not be perfectly accurate or be likely to make mistakes, guys. So here's me predicting the future, and I will freely admit that I could be wrong about this. Here's what I think the future of ray tracing looks like. Future games have a console level setting that will be equivalent to a PC game's low or medium setting. And I think that at that setting, the AMD cards are going to do very well because I think that those are going to be settings that are designed with the consoles in mind. I think that because this is generally how PC games work compared to consoles, the PC games will probably offer an ultra setting that is beyond what the consoles do, that I think AMD's current generation of graphics cards will struggle with. But I think that the Nvidia cards will do better. But again, my personal take on ray tracing is still that usually turning it on and getting that massive performance hit, for me at least, isn't really worth it. But I understand that that's a personal preference, and for some of you guys, you want all the eye candy on, and if you can maintain 60 frames per second at your chosen resolution, it's worth it to you. And that's fine if that's your preference. But that's what I'm getting at. I think that if I'm trying to predict the future, I think that AMD's cards that just launched here are going to do okay at maintaining 60 frames per second ray tracing in consoles, in the next generation of games designed with the current consoles in mind, probably at some kind of console equivalent ray tracing setting that would probably be equivalent to a PC low or medium setting rather than an ultra setting. That's what I'm predicting, and once again, I could be wrong. Okay, so wrapping this all up, where do I stand on the future proofing of the two cards? I think that it's possible that in both cases, you may have to start turning down one or two settings down from ultra to not run into issues. In Nvidia's case, I think it's possible that you might have to slightly turn down textures or slightly turn down a ray tracing setting or some other setting in order to stay under 10 gigabytes on games that come out within the next couple of years. It's possible. Maybe that might still never be the case, though. On the AMD cards, I think that the VRAM obviously will not be an issue, but I think that features like ray tracing could be. But again, I think you might have to live with medium settings or just turn it off if you don't care, guys. Anyway, which is probably where I'd be at. But you might have to live with console equivalent settings rather than PC ultra settings. Again, that's me trying to predict the future, and I could be wrong. So back to my original conclusion. I think the 3090 is your most future-proof card, but you're paying a whole lot of money for that. And I don't think personally that it's worth it, but if you have a lot of money to throw at it, it might be worth it to you for the peace of mind. Now, the other option here is to wait a little while and see how Nvidia responds to the AMD cards. Because, imagine us getting a 3080 Ti with 20 gigabytes that maybe costs $1,000 instead of $1,500. That might make more sense to you than the 3090, and that is rumored to be coming out. What I would personally really like to see is a card that splits the difference between the 3070 and the 3080, so something like a 3070 Super or Ti, and I would love it if they gave it 12 gigabytes or more of VRAM instead of 10 or 8. I think that maybe priced at $600, right? Split the price and performance difference between a 3070 and a 3080, but stick 12 gigabytes of VRAM on it, and you'd have an extremely compelling card from Nvidia. Now, to be clear, I have not seen, and maybe they're out there, but I have not seen a rumor of that happening. And I believe any 3070 Ti rumors that I saw had it predicted at more like 10 gigabytes of VRAM, which once again, now you're running into that same kind of an issue. And the last thing again is that all of this matters a lot more at 4K, because at 1440p or 1080p, the VRAM usage goes down. When you look at VRAM usage, it drops with the resolution. So since a lot of people don't really care about 4K, I think if you're gaming at 1440p, you're much less likely to ever, well, not ever, but to have issues with 10 gigabyte limit at 1440p in the next couple of years. It's much less likely to be an issue. And also with AMD for ray tracing, since the performance demands at 1440 or 1080 are a lot lower, you're more likely to be able to maintain a good ray tracing experience, possibly even at ultra settings at 1440p in a lot of future titles. So this all depends a lot on your planned resolution that you're gaming at. Now, nobody can predict the future. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section. I hope you guys have an excellent day.